It's a real treat to be here today to speak with three of the region's top leaders, starting with the Maryland Attorney General, Anthony Brown. I'm hoping that today's conversation will let us hear key insights about important issues the AGs are working on, their priorities for next year, and how the region's businesses can partner with them. I think every business that's participating in today's conversation would really like to know how they can better engage with these important leaders. So with that, let's get into it. As I mentioned, our first guest is Maryland Attorney General Anthony Brown. General Brown, it is an absolute pleasure to speak with you today. You made history this year as the first African-American Attorney General of the state of Maryland. In your swearing-in remarks, you talked about three priorities: civil rights enforcement and making sure that your office could take that on, public safety, and police reform. I would like to start with some of your efforts to address public safety, given that that has been a hot topic in the region. I'll start with a question related to a filing that I think your office did last week. You asked that the full 15-judge Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals review a recent decision that was striking down a Maryland law that would require the purchase of handguns to go through a qualification process. If that qualification process is struck down, can you talk a little bit about how that could potentially impact the region, especially as we look at gun violence and the flow of illicit guns into the region?
Sure. First of all, Michele, thanks. Thanks to you for moderating. It's great seeing you again. Want to thank Jack, the team at the Greater Washington Board of Trade, for what you're doing to promote a very vibrant regional economy and communities. So it's great to be here as part of this leadership series. You know, the focus for us in public safety, it's multifaceted, and one of them is keeping guns off the streets, and that's guns who are in the hands of people who have no business of owning guns, right? So we're not talking about Second Amendment and responsible gun ownership. We're talking about the proliferation of guns on our streets in the hands of those who shouldn't have it. So in Maryland, and this is when I was lieutenant governor, we passed a law that required that you have a qualification license before you purchase a weapon. And that required fingerprinting in order to do the background check that is required by federal law. We thought a fingerprint would certainly make that much more effective and comprehensive, and minimal training. The training we think is important because people who handle firearms, and I was in the military, it's good to have training, but the training also is a good screen so that you can minimize straw purchases. So the court overturned that qualification license requirement. We're defending that in the Fourth Circuit. We've asked for en banc review. We actually are confident that we're going to be successful because we don't think that the ruling was sound, but we respect it. And if it's not successful, certainly as the Attorney General, I will continue to work with the legislature to look at ways that we can keep guns out of the hands of people that don't have any business owning them, while meeting the requirements of whether it's the Supreme Court in the Bruin case, whether it's the Fourth Circuit in this case, because I think that you can strike the right balance, and we've been doing that in Maryland for the past several years.
Thank you so much for the answer. I will say, you mentioned you want to continue to work with the legislature. I think businesses in the region would love to figure out how they could also work with you to be helpful in this effort. I think specifically when we look at juvenile crime, as I'm sure you're aware, there has been an uptick in juvenile crime. I'm sure the proliferation of illegal handguns has not helped in that effort. Some companies like Uber we've contributed to nonprofits that provide programs for youth. We've also used our platform to get kids to and from after school programs, or get volunteers from those programs, to and from. And so I think I would love to hear your insights on how, in addition to the work that you're going to do with the General Assembly, how can businesses really be helpful here in using their resources to help you as you tackle this issue?
Sure. And Michele, I certainly don't want to minimize the concern among the public about public safety. And the concerns focused a lot recently on juvenile crimes. I do think, though, it's important, whether you're in government, you're in business, or even at home, that you make decisions based on facts and the evidence. And juvenile crime is on the decline, except in two areas, and they're important areas. One is in terms of firearm-related offenses, and the other is in carjacking. And they're important, and we need to get after that. And I know that from Uber's standpoint, certainly the safety of your drivers is often at risk almost daily due to the rise in carjacking. So a number of things we need to do as we focus on juvenile crime. Yes, we need to investigate and prosecute and take repeat offenders, particularly off the streets when we're talking about juvenile offenders, wraparound services to make sure that they have what they need because they still are young people. They are children. We call them juveniles when they do bad things, but they are children. The answer to the question, what can the business community do? I think some of the things that you mentioned that Uber doing is great. It's about opportunities for young people. In Maryland, we have the Maryland Blueprint for Maryland's Future, which is investments in equity education. There's a big emphasis on apprenticeships. So I would say to the business community, particularly in Maryland, join with your local school boards in the efforts that they're undertaking to create more apprenticeship opportunities for young people who have no intention of going to college. We still want them to be motivated and engaged in our school system. Apprenticeships, career technology education is an important pathway for them. And that's where business can partner with local education and really make a difference. So that's one thing I would recommend that your colleagues in the business community consider.
That's enormously helpful. One thing that you and I have spoken about is your passion in terms of addressing recidivism. And I know that you have participated with the Maryland Equitable Justice Collaborative, and that has recently made some headlines. Can you talk about some of the measures that you plan on enacting to address the problem of mass incarceration? Because I think we first talked about the public safety issue and trying to address that. But then once people are in the system, we don't want them to return back to old habits, right? We want to make sure that they're able to move along. And so I'm just curious if you can share a little bit about what you think the work of this organization can do to help address mass incarceration.
Sure, and thanks for asking that question because the Maryland Equitable Justice Collaborative is one of my most important strategic initiatives as Attorney General. It really recognizes that, in Maryland, the sad data set is that, while African Americans make up and African American men make up less than 30% of the population, we are 71% of the prison population. So there is an over-incarceration, a racial disparity in our prison populations. And the collaborative is looking at the full continuum of the criminal system to see what changes we can make to reduce that over-incarceration, to create opportunities both before, during, and after incarceration. You mentioned recidivism. I want to do a hat tip to my colleagues in Virginia. Their recidivism rate is closer to 20%. Which means when someone's released from jail within 3 years, about 20% may return. We'd like to get that down even lower. But in Maryland, we're north of 40%. So what we need to look at what Virginia is doing. What are we doing to create opportunities for returning citizens, employment services, housing services, health services, addressing some behavioral and often drug and alcohol addiction treatment needs. When we reduce that recidivism rate, it does a number of things. It puts people back on the path to productive, constructive lives. It makes for safer communities. And although this one is always hard to believe, it actually saves taxpayers money because it costs a lot more to maintain someone in jail than it does to invest in them as they return to the community to reestablish themselves as productive citizens.
That's great. I think that's a wonderful organization. While I was in law school, I did a little bit of work on criminal appeals, and one of the things we wanted to make sure was that if people were released, that they got the resources that they needed. I'd like to switch just a little bit from what you're doing just as the Maryland AG and talk a little bit about your work with other state AGs. You recently joined a coalition of, I think, about 41 state attorneys general, so it's bipartisan, and a lawsuit against Meta, arguing that their platforms have caused harm to children's mental health and that they haven't been forthcoming about the risks that their platforms may pose to mental health. Can you offer a little bit of insight into this lawsuit and your thinking? And then I'd also be curious to hear from you. Selfishly, I do work for a tech company, talking a little bit about, the balancing the advances of technology, but also addressing the dangers of social media and how companies can sort of make sure that they are not on the end of that lawsuit. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the lawsuit and then where a good balance could be?
Sure. Look, technology and social media platforms have had so many positive effects in our community, society, businesses, and even spreading democracy around the world, right? So internationally, globally, nationally. But based on investigations and documents that attorneys general have seen, based on what we've heard, particularly from former employees of some of these social media platforms, there's a real concern that the platforms are not being responsible in terms of, number one, age gating, so making sure that young kids cannot access the platforms without parental consent. They can do a lot better in that. The algorithms they use that tend to push harmful content, particularly towards teenagers, and the data supports that. Sadly, there is a correlation we see between that harmful content, a child's time spent on a social media platform, and suicide rates. We see online bullying that happens and harassing. So as you point out, bipartisan group of attorneys general, 41 states have joined together, looking at how we can bring the social media platforms in line with much better practices. This is not about money. It's really not about damages, although a lot of damage has been done. This is about injunctive relief, getting the social media platforms to do responsible age gating, to make sure that the content is positive or certainly doesn't encourage harmful content showing up on the screens of young people. So the fact that it's bipartisan, I think, speaks loudly about this consensus that we've got a real problem.
I'd like to kind of keep under this theme of you working with your colleagues. You mentioned Virginia. It is interesting. Maryland, DC, and Virginia are three distinct jurisdictions, and yet we all do work very closely together. I think most of the businesses that are on here probably operate in all three jurisdictions. There is differences in regulatory frameworks across the region. So I'm curious, how do you and how do you work with your fellow AGs in the region to sort of function cohesively under a relatively consistent legal framework? I know that might be a little bit difficult because the General Assembly in Virginia is different than the General Assembly in Maryland, it's different than the DC Council, but just curious how you all work together. And if there's anything you can share, I understand that there are things you all keep confidential, but if there are any issues or initiatives that you work on with other AGs in the region, I think we'd love to hear about that too.
Sure. And in terms of that regional collaboration, it is a little bit more challenging in terms of attorneys general and the legal framework versus what you see often governors do, right? The governors and the mayor of the District of Columbia working policy issues, a lot of discretion, a lot of leeway, how you apply your resources, what your priorities are. Less, I think, leeway, but not that it doesn't exist. So I'll give you an example. One of the areas that I'm very focused on is looking at organized retail theft. And I know that our colleague, Kwame Raoul in Illinois, has set up a task force around organized regional theft. So it's my goal going into 2024 to create a regional task force enlisting Brian in the District of Columbia and his local law enforcement partners, as well as Jason in Virginia, particularly as Northern Virginia, the District of Columbia, Maryland, this region that works together. Organized retail theft sees no boundaries, and you see these rings operating in multiple jurisdictions. So I think given the legal framework that we have, the laws that we have on the books, aligning resources and priorities, I think we can work collaboratively. So that's one example of where we can. And going into 2024, it's a priority for me that we will be doing that around organized retail theft.
Fantastic. General Brown, I want to ask you, just shift a little bit back towards Maryland. Maryland's Legion repealer statute has recently made headlines in light of an ongoing resale price maintenance investigation. Can you speak to some of the ways that retailers and producers can avoid running afoul of antitrust regulations around bilateral pricing strategies, and maybe how the outcome of this investigation may impact future scrutiny?
Sure. And one of the things we don't like to do as attorney generals make headlines. And so certainly, look, I've got a robust and antitrust division. Our mission, our goal is to make sure that Maryland's economy is competitive. It's competitive for businesses. It's competitive for consumers. Back in 2009, Maryland passed a law, right? The only state that has done so, that essentially says that, resale price maintenance agreements that set minimum prices are illegal. That was a policy decision set by the General Assembly. I get that we're the only state in the nation that has that on the books as a statute. So it's our responsibility in Maryland and mine as the Attorney General, as we're ensuring that it's a competitive marketplace, that prices are competitive for consumers, that whether you're a wholesaler or retailer or distributor, you understand the rules of the road in Maryland. So those contracts, any collusive behavior that would set minimum prices, you can't do it in Maryland. Now, we're going to look, and I know my antitrust division chief said we're looking at substance over form. So as we're looking at those agreements, because we know agreements exist between wholesalers and retailers as they're delivering goods to market. But as we're looking at those agreements, we're going to be considering the substance of those relationships and those agreements and making sure that they're not anti-competitive and they're not setting minimum prices that would be in violation of the statute passed by Maryland's General Assembly. So I won't speak to any specific investigation, but as a general matter, we want a competitive economy in Maryland, and we're certainly willing to work with the business community when we see behavior that we think is anti-competitive. I'd rather settle. When I say settle, I'd rather have conversations around these issues to avoid litigation and enforcement actions. And that's my commitment to the business community, to stay in constant communication.
I will tell you, I think many of us really do appreciate that. And that clarity. The last thing I will ask you, because I know we are coming up on the end of our conversation, you talked a little bit about the legislative priorities or your priorities for 2024. I'm just curious, what do you think some priorities may come up next year during the General Assembly that may impact the business community, or maybe even need the support of the region's business community? I know you are super busy in your office, but if you do have any insights into your colleagues at the General Assembly, we would love to hear it.
Sure. And look, I don't know if my priorities are necessarily those that are going to be welcomed by the business community, but I do think that working together, we can achieve our goals and find consensus. I mean, one of the things that I'm looking at is when we have mergers within the healthcare industry, and less so around hospitals and more around nursing homes and assisted living facilities, I'd like to have pre-merger notification. Our Department of Health is seeing a correlation between some of these mergers and a degradation in the quality of care. So we want some pre-merger notification so we know who's doing what in Maryland when it comes to providing skilled nursing care to Marylanders. We want to look at strengthening our Consumer Protection Act. And I think this one's going to take a little bit of work with the business community. I think it helps particularly our small business community. Right now, Maryland's Consumer Protection Act applies primarily to individual consumers. I also want to be able to protect my small businesses who themselves are consumers and often are at a real disadvantage to bigger businesses who are acting in unfair and deceptive ways. So we want to modify our Consumer Protection Act. I think we can find consensus with the business community around that one as well.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with the Board of Trade and its members today. I really actually think you gave us a lot to think about. I took tons of notes as you were talking. And so I just want to thank you again, General Brown, and I hope you have a wonderful holiday season.
Well, thanks. Thanks to you, Michele, and also again to Jack and the team at the Greater Washington Board of Trade. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Bye now. Happy holidays.